Welcome to the science intersection, where technology, ethics, and the environment meet on your plate. Today, we're getting real about something that sounds straight out of science fiction, lab-grown meat. But this isn't about the hype. We're talking with Travis, a researcher who's been deep in the trenches of cultured meat development, from the lab bench to the bioreactor and everything in between. How close are we to buying lab-grown meat burgers at the supermarket? Can this tech really reduce our environmental footprint? And what are the hurdles no one's talking about? Let's find out. For our podcast audience, I'm here with Travis Kalu, who's a postdoc at UCL. So, disclaimer here. I know you through someone in the department, and I kind of felt it'd be nice to introduce you a bit more to the audience because I have a bit more background on you. So, you like fantasy and sci-fi. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your kind of engagement with fantasy and sci-fi?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so in my spare time, I like playing video games. I'm a massive Metroid and Zelda fan. So a big Star Trek fan, which I'll draw parallels with in my work whenever I'm given the chance. At my desk, I've got a nice Starfleet Science Division mug, a nice USS Enterprise plaque, and ever since I was in my PhD days, I worked out a system where you can compare Starfleet ranks to ranks on the academic ladder. And if you ever watch The Next Generation, they wear pips on their collars to denote their ranks. And I've always kept the number of pips I wear consistent with whatever my rank has been at that time. So at the moment, postdoc is equivalent to commander, which is 3 gold pips.
So now we've covered the chain of command. We'll go on to the subject of this podcast, which is lab-grown meat, which Travis researches at UCL. Would you like to tell the audience anything else about yourself?
Well, that covers about the basics. I think I've been in the field since 2015, so yeah, I've been lurking around for quite a while. I did my PhD in cultured meat at Bath, then worked 2 years at a cultured meat startup in Cambridge, and now I'm here doing the same at UCL.
What kind of motivated you and your colleagues to go into this area?
Well, for me, it was animal welfare based. When I finished my undergrad, I started thinking about how I can apply my science to, ideally like reducing animal slaughter or something like that, and that led me into cultured meat. In my experience, though, that's quite a rare motivation. I've only ever met 2 other people in the field who've come at it from that angle. Most people seem to be interested in it because of the environmental implications. Some of them are interested because they like the novel food concept. They think it's quite cool. And some of them, like my previous line manager, was headhunted because of their skills in molecular biology and cell culture and things like that. But yeah, for me, it's about animals.
How much more environmentally friendly is lab-grown meat?
So I can talk a bit about general environmental implications, and hopefully it touches on what you had in mind. So at the moment, it's hard to say because we still don't have like a solid model of how this is going to work. So all the environmental estimations are estimates and based on a lot of theoretical components. So, for example, there's, I think, one that's most cited in the field assumes that we might be making the feedstock for the cells from cyanobacteria that we might grow in ponds, and that will use a 1,000-litre stirred tank bioreactor working at 80% capacity, and will make 1,000 kilos of meat in every 60 days. And for that, they determined that cultured meat would use 10% of the land, 10% of the water of beef production, produce 10% as much greenhouse gases, and use 60% as much energy. But then later, they said, okay, what if we change this around? Say we're using corn for feedstock and a hollow fiber bioreactor, and then the energy usage went way up, just slightly higher than beef, and the water usage went up to about 50% of beef. But generally, it's assumed that it'll be less water, less land, and less greenhouse gas emissions than traditional meat. It's just a question of how much, and energy is a bit up in the air depending on, what kind of bioreactor systems we use.
So could you explain a bit about you use a bioreactor to produce the lab-grown meat?
Mainly, we think we're going to be working with stirred tank vessels because they're most scalable. And for those, it's just basically, a big tank that you have your meat in, and you usually seed your cells on what we call microcarriers, which are small microscopic kind of beads that are made of various materials. Some are better than others. So you seed them on those, and then they all go into the liquid that we call culture media, which is basically cell food. And then there's an impeller that keeps it all stirring and keeps everything moving around so that you don't get gradients of nutrients or dissolved gases like oxygen, pooling in certain places. And the theory is as they grow, you can add more microcarriers to give them more space to grow. And ideally, we want it to be like an edible microcarrier. So the model that I think a lot of us have in mind for this would be like a minced product where you can just squash it all down into just a mass of meats that you can then shape into patties or sausages and something like that. And the vessel is controlled for pH, heated to 37 degrees. Things like oxygen input are also very carefully monitored, and there are various ways that they can be fed. You might have what we call a perfusion system or a continuous fed system where fresh media is always being pumped in and old media is always being pumped out. Or you could have fed batch, which is where after 2-3 days you take all the liquid out and replace it with something new.
How efficient is the process at the moment? How close are we to actually having lab-grown meat on the shelves in the UK?
So on the shelves is a bit of a tricky one. I know some companies have products that they've submitted for regulatory approval. That might take a year, 2 years to get through that process, and then depending on what they decide there, it might end up in maybe high-end restaurants, because I think it'll be quite expensive at the moment. The process at the moment, we've still got roadblocks like making them differentiate faster, and lots of things like additives in the media that we're trying to scale back the cost, and these are the things we're kind of working on to make it more efficient. It's hard to give a simple answer because the efficiency is kind of a whole area of study in itself. One of my colleagues when I was at Bath, his entire thesis was kind of about that, and there's lots of really complicated equations he's using for glucose mass transfer and mass of cells versus amount of X, Y, or Z, and it was all stuff I didn't understand. So it's hard for me to put an exact number on the efficiency, but yeah, there are still things we need to optimize, like getting them to differentiate in a more timely manner, because say things like fat, going from stem cell to adipocyte, which is a fat cell, will take about 21 days, which is too long. So these are things we kind of need to get down.
I've heard that Singapore actually has lab-grown meat already, so how come it's kind of they've got there first, as it were?
So it's not so much they've got there first, they've approved it first, is what they've done. So Singapore import 90% of their food, and so they're a lot more open to novel food technologies and things like that. And they've got the Singapore Food Agency, which, has very strict safety regulations and screenings on all these incoming food technologies. So they've basically approved it. So all the cultured meat companies like over here and in America are kind of trying to ship their products over there to get validated and tested. And also the public is more open to it. In places like America, I think Florida recently this year outright banned cultured meat. And the governor there was saying, how did he phrase it? He's standing against the global elite who want to force everyone to eat meat grown in petri dishes. So it's also a difference in attitudes. I think over here we're not quite that conservative about it, but I think we're still wary of it. The EU regulations about GMOs are very, very strict, whereas I think Singapore is a lot more open to what they'll try out.
So have you actually tried lab-grown meat yourself?
I haven't. The only time I've had the opportunity has been when it's been made from cells sourced from dead flesh that came from an abattoir. And I'm vegetarian, so to me that's still slaughter derived, so that's not something I would try. The ultimate model is to make it using cells sampled from, live, well cared for animals by like a needle biopsy. That I would try. But yeah, we're not quite there yet.
So actually, out of interest, where is the source for the lab-grown meat in Singapore?
I couldn't say off the top of my head because I don't know exactly which company it is, and they've almost certainly got that, under tight IP wraps. There's a lot of different options. Each company is going to be very tight-lipped about how they're doing it, because so they don't want people, stealing their ideas. I think the most common way we might use in academia is take a needle biopsy for a very small sample of muscle. And what you have in muscle is something called satellite cells. And these are dormant muscle cells that are kind of lurking around the muscle fibers. So when you go to the gym, for example, and you lift weights and you get small tears in your muscle fibers, they sense that damage and they wake up, they divide and grow and form more muscle to kind of patch that together and make it a bit bigger. So we're kind of trying to leverage that and stimulate those to wake up and make muscle for us in a lab setting. The problem with them is they're not designed, or they're not really evolved to do that over a long period of time. As mammals, we've evolved for wound repair rather than like growing whole new systems. So they kind of grow for maybe 4 or 5 what we call passages, which is when we take them out of one flask and put them in another one so they have more space to grow. Then after that, they kind of go into what we call senescence, where they stop growing, which isn't what we want. So other ways people might get around that is to use what we call iPSCs, induced pluripotent stem cells, which is where you take various kind of cells, like you could have skin cells, epithelial cells. There's a lot of different options there, so everyone's going to pick something different that they think might be more cost effective or easy to source. And you reprogram them to go back to a state where they can become various kinds of cells, because once cells have become something like a muscle cell, that's what they are forever. They stop growing and they just live as. So you want to go back to when they're a bit younger and they have more options. So we would reprogram them to go back to that state. That's what we call an iPSC. But then there's various ways you can do that too. Lots of different technologies. Some of them are and some of them aren't classed as GMOs. So that also comes into play, where you are kind of intending for your product to be. If you're wanting to sell in the EU, you're going to stay as far away from GMOs as you can. And there's another type of cell, what we call an immortalized cell line, which is great for research because they never stop dividing, but probably wouldn't be marketable as a food product, because you've probably also heard of another type of cell that won't stop dividing, and that's a cancer cell. Although there is a difference between immortalized cells and cancer cells. Immortalized cells are much more genetically stable, we can control them better, whereas cancer cells are just wild cards and do whatever they want, and you can't really do anything with them to stop them. Yeah, those are the various kinds of approaches we'll be using in the sector. But as for what people are specifically doing, that's all very hush-hush.
And you said it took a while, like, was it 20-something days for the cells to grow?
And not so much for them to grow. So once we've grown them to a certain mass, we want them to do what we call differentiating, which is becoming a certain type of cell. So for meats, we want obviously muscle, but we also want fat, because that's what gives it a lot of the flavour and the juiciness and that lot. Fat differentiation takes a long time, so that's what takes 21 days. And then we still kind of got the question of how we can do this together, or like, can we grow muscle cells and fat cells together? Because they respond to different things in the media they're kept in, and what stimulates one might inhibit the other. Or will we have to grow them separately and then kind of smush it together at the end of the process? Ideally, we'd like to grow them together to keep it simple and, save down on operational costs and times and things like that. But yeah, that is a time constraint. Adipogenesis, i.e. fat differentiation, takes quite a while. Muscle differentiation is a lot quicker. You can induce myoblasts, baby muscle cells, to become myofibers in about, I think the fastest I've ever done it is 4 days. So yeah, that's not too bad. But yeah, fat takes a long time.
So you're talking about the media that these things are grown in.
Mm.
So can you just take us through the media a little bit more?
I think the one we use most is called DMEM, Dulbeco's Minimum Essential Media. And that basically means it contains minimum number of like amino acids and growth factors that most cells need. A lot of media in research and academia for like pharmaceuticals and stuff will have what we call serum, which is it's kind of hard to define. I think way back in the early 1900s, when one of the first cell culture scientists was starting out, he kind of extracted a nondescript fluid from, I think it was frogs, and he realised when you add that to a salt solution, it makes cells live longer, or makes them grow. And he just called it serum. And to this day, we don't exactly know what it is. It kind of varies batch to batch and one animal to another. The serum that's most commonly used in research is called FBS, fetal bovine serum, which is extracted from calf hearts, which I don't like at all. And that's a very crucial component of media that there was still a lot of work trying to replace. Serum-free media optimization is a whole field in and of itself. A lot of people are working on that. The alternatives to that are also going to be under IP, but companies like Maltus, I think Maltus is probably one of the more well-known ones that are in the cellular agriculture or cultivated meat space, working on non-animal things that we can swap out for our media. Obviously things like glucose and growth factors. Depending on what kind of cell type you're using, things like insulin growth factor, there's a lot of, strings of letters I can name, FGF or BFGF2 and things like that may or may not be in the media because they stimulate cells, certain types of cells to grow faster. But then that also raises questions for us like, if we use this, is it going to be food grade at the end of the process? So things like with adipogenesis, the fat differentiation, the gold standard will use something called dexamethasone. But if you use that, it's going to be very hard to make it a food-safe product because I think that's a drug or a pharmaceutical of some kind. So yeah, media formulation is geared very much towards the individual cells in terms of what growth factors are in it. It's all usually at the same pH and same glucose concentrations, more or less. And we're trying to, replace the serum in it. And I also think there's a drive to not use antibiotic in it for obvious reasons.
The beads in the actual thing, what are the beads?
The microcarriers that we were talking about. So that's what we call a scaffold. There are various kinds of scaffold. I mentioned microcarriers because I think that's going to be the most prominent going forward. The way I've always explained this to people is the same way you can't dropping cells into media and expecting them to assemble into a tissue or a piece of muscle is kind of like throwing bricks up in the air and expecting them to assemble into a building. It's just kind of a very complex process, and it needs kind of something to hold itself together on. You need a scaffolding up while the building gets put in place, and the cells need something to adhere to while they go through all these complex processes of, growing, dividing, getting in contact. They kind of talk to each other in a way, and all this signaling that goes on to tell them it's time to start differentiating and what to start differentiating into. So microcarriers, the beads, are one type of scaffold. So they come in a lot of different forms, porous, non-porous. There's some that I'll be working on soon that are edible, so that's quite exciting. Made of various different materials, some animal-derived. I think the gold standard ones are animal-derived. I've worked with some that aren't. My PhD was actually about making scaffolds from a protein called zein, which is found in corn. But yeah, so microcarriers, because they're very highly scalable, they go into stirred tank bioreactors, which is kind of what we're looking at, we think. And you can just dump more in there to give them more surface area. Other types of scaffolds, like fibrous scaffolds, so that corn protein I mentioned, when I was doing my PhD, the main method, I was able to make a scaffold from it, because I tried and I couldn't make microcarriers out of it. Any other types of scaffolds I can think of? Hydrogels are another one. Well, as the name implies, they're mostly water and they're gelatinous. The ones I've worked with are made from seaweed, so alginate or carrageenan, which are edible, so they're good. So yeah, so short answer, microcarriers are the simplest and probably the most scalable scaffold that we use to grow our cells on. And they can also be porous, so cells can grow inside them as well as on the surface.
One last question about the method. So you said you need to stir the thing. So assuming that's just for just mixing all the components and distributing the components.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. And also to kind of disperse everything else. So not just the components that are coming in, but if you have a big clump of cells growing in one spot, they will also be kind of sitting in their own waste. Obviously not the kind of waste we produce, but things like carbon dioxide and lactic acid, and that's going to impair their growth. So by stirring it, you kind of distribute that evenly across the whole system. So all your cells are growing in the same way rather than these cells are growing really well, these cells are half dead, these ones are slow growing, things like that. So just to maintain what we call homogeneity, keep everything consistent.
What other things do you think are important in terms of getting lab-grown meat onto the market?
There is an interesting question I've been asked. I don't have an answer for it though, but maybe it'll spark a debate with your audience. So I was at a conference once, the Cultured Meat Conference, and one of the speakers was a rabbi, and he came up and said he's been wrestling with the question a lot as to whether cultured meat is kosher or not. And he said there is no consensus on this. It's still very open, up in the air, because cultured meat obviously removes slaughter from the equation, and kosher, one of the aspects of kosher is a ritual slaughter. And then so there's the question of, if you take that slaughter out of the equation, are you removing the need for it to go through that ritual slaughter, or are you making it so that it can never meet that requirement and therefore is never kosher? Because you can tick all the other boxes in terms of I think I'm not Jewish, so I don't really know what the kosher requirements are. I think it's things like what part of the animal, what type of animal it is, the blood has to be drained, all of these things we can compensate for and we can control. But without the slaughter, is it kosher? And then, I think the same question will apply to things like halal and other requirements and things like that. There's also a question as to whether it would be called vegan or vegetarian. I personally don't think it would, because it is still, real meat. So the word I use is cruelty-free or slaughter-free. But yeah, I think the kosher halal debate is going to be an interesting one. But yeah, like I say, I don't have an answer.
That's a wrap. Thanks for listening. Hope you follow the podcast, follow the Science Intersection on social media, and share.